What's up, guys? Ryan Dennis here with the A Scene, your premier source for all things entertainment. And today we are remembering the iconic Cicely Tyson. And here to join me today is her dear friend, Mr. Bill Liss.
Well, thank you very much, Ryan. I'm really so privileged to be here and to be part of the 11 Alive family for as long as I have been. Makes it even more of an honor that you have asked me to come on here. And yes, we have had a relationship with Cicely Tyson, my wife Debbie and I, that goes back a very, very long way, going all the way back to an airplane ride. And Cicely turning to me and asking me if I was a pen salesman because I had pens all the way across my attaché case. And that started a friendship which lasted all the way until she passed.
I'm glad that we have someone with a wealth of knowledge and candid experience. It's incredible to truly, you know, as an African American, to know of her story, but to know that her story was true to life, it really means a lot.
Well, you know, I mean, it's just, you know, the fact is, what you have to do, Ryan, you can't ever look at color. That is so obviously ridiculous. You look at what's inside people. And what's inside of Cicely Tyson, it doesn't matter whether she was African American or white or whatever she was. She was an extraordinary person, and she would have been no matter what she was. But what she brought to the African American community in the way of pride, in the way of showing this can be done, and you have to set your goals. This is what she told these youngsters at the Dance Theater of Harlem. Set your goals high. It doesn't matter, like I mentioned earlier, about where you live. It's what's within you. And that's what she was. That's what she was entirely. You didn't look at her because she was what she looked like. You looked at her because of what was inside of her. And it was extraordinary.
Bill, how are you feeling this morning after the news?
Well, it was quite a shock. I mean, she was 96 years old, but I can tell you this woman had as much energy as anyone I've ever met and anyone I ever knew. And she made a commitment that she was just going to go on and on and on and continue acting because she was so extraordinary. And that's exactly what she did. I mean, the last time my wife and I saw her was on Broadway with James Earl Jones a few years back. And we went up to her dressing room after the show and we spent a good hour with her, just my wife and I and Cicely and her assistant, just the four of us, just reminiscing and talking and chatting. And she was as lively and extraordinary as ever. She was an amazing human being, and we feel enormously privileged that we knew her as well as we did, and we were able to spend so much time with her. It was a great honor for us.
And we hear about these stories about Cicely and how her character was just as dynamic as she was on screen. How did you two meet?
Well, so that's kind of a fascinating story, actually, Ryan. I was on an airplane flying to California. At that time, I was the senior vice president of RJ Nabisco, senior VP of public affairs, and I was sitting on the airplane, and sitting next to me was this very lovely woman who, of course, you know, you don't get really to talk to the person next to you until the conversation starts. And she looked over to me, and I had a habit of carrying a attaché case with pens all the way across the top. The reason I did, whenever I'd run out of ink, I'd toss them out. So I had a whole bunch of them. So she looked over to me, sitting next to me, and she said, "Excuse me, sir, are you a pen salesman?" And I said, "Gosh, no, I'm not." But she says, "Well, you have all those pens. Why do you have them?" Well, got into a conversation. She says, "Well, by the way, I'm Cicely Tyson." And of course, I did one of these things. And I told her who I was and what I did. And we started to talk. And she says, "You know, Bill, I have an idea." She says, "I'm very active with the Dance Theater of Harlem. And since you're a senior vice president of RJ Nabisco and you guys have Oreo cookies and wheat thins and all that great stuff, how would you like to work with me on doing something for the youngsters who are up in Harlem and going to school up in Harlem to really educate them about the arts?" And I said, "Cicely, that's a fabulous idea." So we continued to talk about it. And the end of that story was we then kept in touch when I got off the plane in California, in Los Angeles, and so did she. And we both agreed to do something rather unique, and it's exactly what we did. She got me in touch with the people who ran the Dance Theater of Harlem, and we contacted the New York City Board of Education, and we also contacted Mayor Dinkins, who was the mayor of New York. And we said we were going to try to bring as many youngsters from Harlem as we could in the Harlem surrounding area to the Mann Auditorium, which was part of CCNY in Harlem. It was a huge auditorium. And we would have a performance by the Dance Theater of Harlem for as many youngsters as we could fit in the hall. And we would supply, as RJ Nabisco, and since I had a very wonderful position there, I could do this, that we would bring in all the food, all the snacks and all the food for these youngsters. And of course, we owned Planters Peanuts, we owned Wheat Thins, we owned, as you know, Oreo cookies. I mean, we had a vast array of food. So we would bring in all the food. and we would bring these children to the Dance Theater of Harlem. Well, it turned out that we ended up with over 1,000 youngsters. Now, how do you get them there? Interesting point. So we had lunch with David Dinkins, Cicely and I, and a small group. And Mayor Dinkins and I, we agreed, okay, the way we would do it is we'd get New York City school buses to go to all these schools, pick up all these youngsters, bring them to the main auditorium, and that's how we get them there. Well, we ended up having to do it twice because there were so many youngsters. It ended up being almost 1,000. There were so many that we had to have all these school buses in groves. Now, the main auditorium sits on top of a hill in Harlem. So you can imagine walking outside, and all you could see going down the street with school buses, they went as far as the eye could see. And then after we did the first thing, we got another group. We brought them all back, so it happened twice. We ended up entertaining at the Dance Theater of Harlem and watching two incredible performances by the Dance Theater. And for many of these youngsters, it was the first time in their lives they had ever been exposed to the arts of any kind. And to see their own people, their own dancers performing in their locality of things they never saw before was an extraordinary experience. And of course, we fed them all and did all of that. But looking at the expression on these youngsters' faces, and what I would love to do today, Ryan, but obviously can't do, is to find out how many of those youngsters years ago that were exposed to the Dance Theater of Harlem actually went into the arts. I bet it would be an extraordinary number, probably some very famous people who we could go back and we could resurrect of where those people ended up. Well, that led to a friendship with Cicely, which went on. And when Atlanta hosted the Black Arts Festival here in Atlanta, Debbie and I thought, my wife and I, that it would be wonderful to do a reception at our home, and we could honor Cicely as the honored guest. So Maynard Jackson was the mayor at that time, and I happen to know Maynard very well anyway, because at WXIA, Maynard's brother-in-law, Monty Richardson, was my colleague photojournalist for 9.5 years. His sister, Valerie Jackson, was married to Maynard Jackson. So we had a very close connection between Monty and I working together at WXIA as a team for well over 9 years, and Valerie, and Maynard lived around the corner. So we called Maynard and said, Maynard, would you come over and do it? He said, absolutely. My God, what a terrific thing. So we got a hold of Cicely. She said she'd love to do it. So we hosted this wonderful party at our home with Cicely Tyson as the honored guest. And so the friendship just kept going and going. And then when I left RJR and I connected with Don Allmeyer and working in television production, we were the ones behind Fried Green Tomatoes. And Cicely Tyson starred in Fried Green Tomatoes. So Debbie, my wife, and I, and our daughter Louisa at that time, who was here, we went down to Sonoya, Georgia, where Fried Green Tomatoes was going on. And we had a very private lunch with Cicely. And we went to a small boutique restaurant, Ryan, that was in a private home in Sonoya. And it was one of these places where, people gathered at lunch hour, very private, very quiet. And we walked in and they took one look at Cicely. Me, they ignored, but they took one look at Cicely, and the whole place, there must have been 20, 30 people in there having lunch. Everybody just stood up. And it was an extraordinary experience. So we spent time with her down there. And then, of course, we kept in touch over the years, and I'm sort of moving this thing ahead. And then she started a show a few years ago with James Earl Jones on Broadway. It was a two-person show, Cicely Tyson and James Earl Jones. And after the show, Debbie, my wife, and I, and as I told you earlier, we went up to a dressing room where we spent a good hour. And Cicely had a habit that she would never sit in a chair and talk to you. She had a bed in her dressing room, and she just liked to lie down and rest, because working that show, it's a two-person show, you can imagine, was extraordinary. And she was in her 90s at that point. So, it was amazing. But her energy and just the way she was. But we called, spoke to her people before. Oh, absolutely, Cicely, would love to say hello to you, would love to see you. And so up to her dressing room, we went right after the show. And her graciousness was extraordinary. And she didn't want to stop it. We just kept talking and talking until we looked at our watches. It was almost an hour later. And you had people waiting at the dressing room door outside the theater who wanted to get an autograph. And they kept waiting for that length of time. And I felt kind of bad. I said, Cicely, you got all these people outside. Yeah, but Bill, seeing you and Debbie again is such a kick. Whenever we finish, we finish. That was a great. And then when she was honored at the Kennedy Center, we, of course, kept in touch with her during that time as well. So we had an enormous friendship with her. It lasted right up until it still kept on going. But the last time we saw her was following that Broadway show. And her graciousness was extraordinary. Never a question about going up to her dressing room and seeing her. And we talked about the Dance Theater of Harlem. which we both were smiling about, because to expose that number of youngsters, all starting on asking me if I was a pen salesman on an airplane. That's how the whole thing started.
I absolutely love it. Now, over the years, she's had quite a bit of connections to Georgia. Did she live here for a bit? Does she have a family here as well?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that again? I missed that.
Did she have any family ties to Georgia?
No, I never, not that I know of. Now, she very well may have. She was married, many, many years ago, I believe, to Miles Davis, and they lived in New York City. She lived in New York, but she had a very close connection with Atlanta. And the Black Arts Festival was really one of the key things. She was a very key player in that. And yes, her relationships in Atlanta were tremendous. And I suspect because of all of the entertainment here in Atlanta and all of the record companies here in Atlanta and the enormous success of African Americans in the business, including Tyler Perry and others, I suspect that her relationships here were very, very profound. I think she probably knows an awful lot of people here. We never really talked about it, but when I think about Tyler Perry and I think of the record companies and I think of her enormous involvement with the arts, I would have to assume, whether she had family here or not, I can't tell you, but I would have to assume that her relationships with the art community here have been superb and extraordinary and probably lasted right up until she passed.